Hello, everybody. Welcome to Planet Holistic. I'm your host, Todd Schaefer, and this is
Kira Schaefer.
And today we have a very special guest with us today. We have one of our solo authors in training.
She is. Yeah. Yes. Well, I would say she's already written the book, so I don't know how much in training she is.
Right. We have a wonderful solo author who is part of our solo authors private group on Facebook here, the wonderful Mackie Morelli. Welcome to the podcast, Anne. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great, and I thanks for the great introduction and for having this chance to talk and share about my book.
There's so much that we want to ask you, and specifically about when can we move to beautiful Vancouver?
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have it in the room? And can you fit dogs and a lizard?
well, maybe everybody but the lizard. But yeah, our cat might like him.
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't be good.
So, Anne, what has been your overall experience so far? You know, being in you've got most of your book written, I know, and you're working on whittling it down and finalizing things and whatnot. What's your experience been so far writing the book, and what's your experience been in the solo authors group so far?
Well, I guess part of this is just feedback from my own sense, is that when I wrote the book, I did it just on my own. And then once I got linked up with the solo authors group, I wish I'd done that sooner. I would really recommend that any author link up with other writers and other publishers quicker than I did. I just think that since I've joined the group, I've already, as I am editing and whittling down my book, I have already got some direction about what that might look like and how I could have done it differently. And I just think, boy, it should be easier to start that process at the beginning, like through the mind mapping or the way to write sort of set up your chapters, rather than write it and then kind of go back and say, okay, now let's try these strategies. So for me personally, I think the company of the other writers, with you and with Todd and Kira, you guys as publishers, to the things that you're posting are being incredibly helpful about how to kind of visualize and set up the project. And now, Todd, I see that you've created something about how do you edit and whittle down and sort of refine your project. And I just think it's such a massive thing to do that it would be better to get people on board. It's sort of like an athlete, they're training, and then they find a coach. Much better to find a coach at the beginning and develop really good habits and set it up properly rather than kind of revisit it when it's all said and done. So that's sort of where I'm at with the group, and I think it's a fantastic group, so enthusiastic, so supportive, and I think sharing the writing will be a fantastic thing, and getting feedback from other people about sort of how does that sound, how's it being received. I think the journey of the book has been exciting, though. I mean, I think you have a vision for what you want and you have a passion for that and you kind of run with it. But the problem with that sometimes is then you kind of go detour sometimes, because sometimes you see something, you think that could be helpful or maybe that could be added to the book. But that's where discipline comes in, and keeping that mind map or your outline or your format in place would be really helpful. But I am excited now that I am in the group, that I can see it will help me form this in a much better way as I do my edits. So right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's just so nice to be in a community, I think, yes, for all of our solo authors, and everybody is so engaged and wanting to be of service and help to each other, because you're all in the same boat, So yeah. Let's talk about your book a little bit, because your book really has a purpose. It has a message. It has something that it really wants to contribute to the world. And I say it's almost like it has its own entity. When we create something, like we birth something, it's like, okay, it's no longer ours, and I feel like you've really birthed something here. So tell us a little bit about the mission of the book, or what you're wanting to accomplish with it.
Yeah, it sort of came out of when I sort of semi-retired and stepped away from my educational role as a principal, and I started taking courses in a seminary program. It's a master's degree level, sort of preparing you for Christian leadership, and theology degree that really gets you to dig deep into it. And I took a course on the book of Job, and it's one of the many books in the Bible, but it's a book that a lot of people avoid because it's about suffering. And it's a book. And I had just walked through a season of suffering. I'd lost my mother, and we'd had some illnesses in the family, and just a whole series of things. And I call that a winter season when things are hard. And and I'm a registered clinical counselor. And it's one thing to counsel other people, but when you're in it yourself, it can be very, very different. So I felt really called to take this book of Job, this course that focused on it. And in that course, I mean, it's a beautiful story about a man who's very prosperous, but he just loses everything. And he is absolutely sitting on a garbage heap. He's lost his family, his estate, and he has 4 friends who come to console him, but they do a miserable job. He actually calls them miserable comforters and worthless physicians. They have nothing to add, and in fact, they contribute to more suffering for him. And as I read the book and went through the course, I just thought, golly, is that not a reflection of how most of us struggle when someone's in a winter season? We just don't know how to best approach it. So we either avoid it, we run from it. It's almost as if suffering is contagious. And especially as we follow in the media, as people are coming forward about their abuse, bosses, churches, schools, people and even family aren't very good at how do I respond when someone's suffering or in crisis. So the book was a call in my heart to combine my my counseling degree, my experiences, my training as a registered clinical counselor with this theology of the book of Job, and how do we move us to, and it's an invitation to consider how do we move people from being miserable and inept and not having the language to console people who suffer to supportive, caring, and healing conversations. And how do we invite people to enter those hard spaces with each other? So my hope is that the book will give comfort to people, that they will at least be able to start the journey. I think we'll always stumble. I think when we're trying to help each other, we won't always get it right. But how do we have the courage to enter those spaces and at least give it a try and get better at it as we practice it? And so we don't wound people even more than, they need at that point when they're in their really hard places of suffering.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's huge. And I think you would definitely see a lot of benefit as a spiritual director, as I do, a pastor, a preacher, someone who is in the community of people who are seeking to find relief and find balance and find peace. And I think you and I had talked a little bit about this being potentially a book where it's not just a kind of a storybook, but more of a book that helps to contribute to people's education and being able to utilize tools that you provide from your standpoint as a counselor, as somebody that's been in this world for a long time, and in your own suffering, your own grief, and being able to move through that. So that's huge.
Yeah. The book, I hope, could be used by an individual who's just suffering or has a partner or maybe a colleague at work and they just don't know what to do about it. So they could sit down and then read through it and work through some of the exercises and end up coming to a place where they feel more confident about approaching them. So it could be an individual process, but it could also be, like you mentioned, like a spiritual director at church or a care and compassion pastor who is in charge of supporting people who are suffering. How do they become stronger in that area of being able to provide support? But it could be used in a whole range of areas, but it is at the end of the day a challenge or an invitation to look at how do I see suffering? Because a lot of us don't want to, we think if we're just good people, we won't have suffering, but that's just not true. We'll all have winter seasons at one time or another because we'll always lose something, right? We lose people and we move and we lose jobs. So how do we handle that? So you have to sort of have a sense of what's the theology of suffering, but also, okay, so we have that, but how do we enter and what language do we use? And we could all become better at that for sure.
Beautiful.
Awesome. It sounds great. It sounds like it's going to be a wonderful read and very valuable to people.
Well, that's my hope. I'm very passionate about it. I mean, being as a counselor, I mean, a lot of times people show up in your office wanting to solve the issues that they have and the conflicts, but they just don't have the language. And so a lot of times you're just teaching them what are feelings, how do you address feelings, how do you cope with those? And I think that just becomes more intensified in suffering. We don't like to even have a language of suffering. We prefer to be happy. But that's just not how the world works. It's not Disney where it's happy ever after. So I think, Todd, I hope that it does make a difference. I'd love to believe that people could pick it up and their lives could be changed, and that we would support one another through the tough seasons rather than feel quite isolated. I mean, one of the things about Job, and I think it's the fellow in this book of the Bible, he felt so isolated. He was absolutely ostracized by his community. He felt from being a powerhouse, an elder in the community, to literally being abandoned. And I think that can happen sometimes in suffering. People don't quite know what to do with it. And I'd love to think that we could reach out in a bigger way, kinder way to people when they're on the ropes for some reason.
Do you have a title for this book yet or not?
Well, it's funny because I had to hand in an assignment as a conclusion to this course I took. And at that time, I called the book Moving from Being Miserable Comforters into Consoling Comforters.
Nice.
And it's a play on the words that Job uses when he accuses his friend of increasing his pain. So,
that's a friend. Hey, I'm sorry. Can you leave? You're increasing my pain.
It's true. He calls him. He says, "You're worthless physicians. You actually wound my soul. Like you don't help me at all."
Oh, poor Job.
Oh no, it's a heartbreaking story. But in the end, he's redeemed. But the thing is, it's a bit sad to think that some of the things that these friends say to him, we're still saying thousands and thousands and thousands of years later. Mm-hmm. Like, at what point do we learn that there's a better way, right? Kinder way. So a more compassionate way. So that's my hope that,
Well, you are going to teach them how to find that compassionate way, that better way.
I hope.
Those better words.
Yes. And a better theology that we understand we're going to suffer. So let's get ready for it.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I think it's a wonderful thing that you're writing on this topic, because I think suffering is largely ignored or dealt with poorly. And so giving people tools to express themselves better, to cope better, is going to be one of the great contributions to society with your book, in terms of giving people a path to follow that they can navigate through some of these difficult things. Because I think the world largely doesn't know how to deal with its feelings, the people of the world. So as we start to wrap up here, I want to ask you, what advice would you have for anybody who's maybe considering becoming a solo author?
Well, I guess my experience would be because the writing, I think, is so isolating. You sit in your space to write, and it's very much you're in your own head. And it can be quite lonely. It's an introverted activity. I just so encourage people to link up with other writers. A group like the group that we're part of. I just think that sort of fellowship and encouragement, like both of you have been so incredibly encouraging, that gives me the energy to keep forging ahead. And then you have some direction. Carrie, you and I talked the other day about sort of what should I do with my book, this big manuscript that has to be taken down now into a smaller, kind of more refined version. And that kind of dialogue is really, really important. And so my encouragement with people would be for sure to get into a group and have that feedback quicker than later. It's just encouraging too.
Yeah. And Mackie Morelli, what is your website?
Oh, my website is called The Stones Call. Mm-hmm. And the address is www.thestonescall.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have you on the show today. And we will be talking to you again soon. And guys, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you have a fantastic day.
Thanks, Todd and Kira.
And thank you for joining Planet Holistic.